In suburban Phoenix, an 80-year-old grandmother was about to make a decision that would shake her family to its core. What started as a quiet birthday morning took a shocking turn when she came face to face with complete silence from the 4 children she had sacrificed everything to raise. Margaret Torres wasn't your typical elderly mother waiting patiently for attention. For 5 decades, she had spent her life as the family's emotional anchor and financial safety net, known for her unwavering devotion and selfless love. When she encountered absolute neglect on her milestone birthday, she had no idea she was walking into a moment that would transform everything. Margaret picked up the phone to call a real estate agent that would lead to the most powerful wake-up call her children would ever receive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert sun had not yet kissed the horizon when Margaret Torres opened her eyes on the morning of October 15th. 80 years old today. The number felt foreign in her mind, like a coat that didn't quite fit. She lay still for a moment in the king-sized bed that had felt too large for 5 years now, listening to the familiar sounds of her Ahwatukee neighborhood waking up, the distant hum of early commuters on the freeway, the mechanical whir of pool pumps, the soft rustle of palm fronds in the morning breeze. Her arthritis reminded her of the approaching cooler months as she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet finding the worn Mexican tile that she and Robert had laid themselves 43 years ago. The house held their history in every corner. Scuff marks from when the children played indoor soccer despite her protests, a small burn mark on the kitchen counter from Carmen's first attempt at making flan, David's height measurements still penciled on the doorframe of the pantry. Maggie padded to the kitchen, her routine as established as the sunrise. Coffee first. Always coffee first. As the machine gurgled to life, she reached for her phone, a device that had taken her years to master but now felt like a lifeline to the world beyond her walls. The screen showed no missed calls, no messages. It was only 6:30 a.m., she reminded herself. Still early. The coffee's aroma filled the kitchen as she stepped outside to tend to her garden. The October morning carried just enough chill to make her wrap her robe tighter around her small frame. Her rose garden was her pride. 12 bushes that had survived everything Arizona could throw at them, from haboobs to record-breaking heat waves. She'd planted them the year Mickey was born, watching them grow alongside her youngest child, both requiring patience, attention, and unwavering love. The pink roses were Robert's favorite. Rosa de Guadalupe, he'd called them, because they reminded him of the chapel where they'd been married in 1965. 20-year-old Maggie had worn her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her petite frame, while 22-year-old Robert had borrowed his brother's only suit. They'd had $49 between them and dreams that seemed bigger than the desert sky. She watered each bush carefully, the droplets catching the early light like tiny prisms. "Happy birthday to me," she whispered to the roses, the words carrying no joy, only a hollow acknowledgement of the day's significance. Back inside, muscle memory guided her through making Robert's favorite breakfast: scrambled eggs with chorizo, flour tortillas warmed on the comal, fresh salsa verde with tomatillos from her vegetable garden. It wasn't until she'd set 2 plates on the table that reality struck her anew. She was alone. She'd been alone for 5 years, 2 months, and 16 days. But some mornings, especially special ones, her heart forgot. The eggs grew cold as she checked her phone again. 7:45 a.m. Still nothing. The living room called to her, and she settled into Robert's old recliner, the brown leather cracked and worn smooth by decades of use. The walls around her told the story of a life well lived. Family photos in mismatched frames, children's artwork now yellowed with age, a cross made of palm fronds from Easter services, and the wedding portrait, where she and Robert looked impossibly young and fierce with hope. Her mind drifted to birthdays past, when this house had been the center of the Torres family universe. She'd spend weeks planning celebrations. David's cowboy-themed parties, Carmen's princess phases, Sophia's rebellious insistence on grown-up gatherings even at 8 years old, and Mickey's elaborate sports-themed extravaganzas, complete with neighborhood kids and homemade piñatas. The tradition had continued even after they'd grown and moved away. Every birthday, holiday, and significant life event had been marked within these walls. She'd driven to the airport countless times to collect grandchildren for summer visits, turned the guest room into a nursery whenever her daughters needed help with new babies, and kept the refrigerator stocked with everyone's favorite foods just in case they came home unexpectedly. When had it stopped? When had she become the one waiting for calls instead of receiving them? When had her birthday become just another day on everyone else's calendar? The sound of a key in the front door interrupted her melancholy. Rosa Martinez's cheerful voice called out in accented English, "Buenos dias, Señora Torres. How are you feeling today?" Rosa appeared in the doorway, her scrubs adorned with cheerful cartoon characters, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. At 35, she radiated the kind of energy that Maggie remembered having once upon a time. Rosa's twice-weekly visits had become one of the few constants in Maggie's life since Robert's death, a brief infusion of warmth and genuine care in an increasingly lonely existence. "I'm fine, Mija," Maggie replied automatically, the lie coming as easily as breathing. She'd perfected the art of appearing fine over the decades. Through Robert's heart attack, her own cancer diagnosis, financial struggles she'd never let the children know about, and the crushing loneliness that had settled over her like dust since becoming a widow. Rosa busied herself taking Maggie's blood pressure and checking her pill organizer, chattering about her daughter's school project and her second job at the hospital. It wasn't until she was updating Maggie's chart that she paused, pen hovering over the paper. "Wait, October 15th. Isn't today your birthday, Señora Torres?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Maggie felt her carefully constructed facade of contentment begin to crack. "Yes," she said simply, her voice smaller than she intended. Rosa's face transformed, confusion giving way to concern and then to something that looked suspiciously like anger. "Your birthday? And you're here alone? Where is your family? Where are your children?" The questions pierced Maggie's chest like arrows. Where indeed? David was probably in some meeting in Seattle, managing people and projects with the same efficiency he'd applied to distancing himself from his childhood home. Carmen was likely running between her son's therapy appointments and her daughter's soccer practice, drowning in the kind of overwhelming maternal responsibilities that Maggie remembered all too well. Sophia was undoubtedly billing hours at her prestigious law firm, building the independent life she'd always claimed to want. And Mickey could be anywhere, lost in whatever haze of self-destruction had become his normal. "They're busy," Maggie said, the words tasting like ash. "They have their own lives." Rosa set down her medical bag and sat on the couch across from Maggie, her professional demeanor giving way to something more personal. "Señora Torres, you raised 4 children. You told me how you worked 2 jobs to help pay for David's college, how you took care of Carmen's babies when she had postpartum depression, how you helped Sophia through law school, how you—" "That's what mothers do," Maggie interrupted, but her voice lacked conviction. "And what do children do for their mothers?" Rosa asked gently. The question settled between them like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of truth that Maggie had been avoiding for months, maybe years. When was the last time any of them had called, just to ask how she was feeling? When was the last time someone had visited without needing something? A loan, babysitting, a place to stay during a divorce? After Rosa left with promises to call later and repeated birthday wishes, Maggie found herself standing in the center of her living room, really seeing it for the first time in years. The family photos stared back at her accusingly, images of children who had grown into adults she barely recognized, strangers who shared her name but not her values, not her understanding of what family meant. She walked to the kitchen window that looked out over her neighborhood, watching her neighbors go about their Tuesday morning routines. Mrs. Patterson across the street was loading her grandchildren into her SUV, probably taking them to school while their parents worked. The Johnsons next door were both retired now, spending their mornings walking their ancient golden retriever and tending to their desert landscaping together. Everyone seemed to have someone. Everyone except her. The anger came slowly at first, like water beginning to boil. It started as disappointment, transformed into hurt, and finally crystallized into something harder and more definitive. She was tired. Tired of making excuses for them. Tired of pretending their neglect didn't wound her. Tired of being the one who always called, always reached out, always forgave. Most of all, she was tired of being invisible in the lives of the people she had sacrificed everything to raise. Her reflection in the kitchen window showed a woman who had spent 8 decades putting everyone else first. Her gray hair was still neatly styled from yesterday's salon appointment. A weekly ritual she maintained not for herself, but in case one of them decided to visit unexpectedly. Her house was still immaculate, guest rooms always ready, refrigerator stocked with favorites they no longer ate, traditions maintained for celebrations that no longer happened. The phone sat silent on the counter, its silence more eloquent than any words. 80 years old, and not one of her 4 children had remembered the day that marked her arrival in this world, the beginning of the life she had dedicated entirely to their well-being. Something fundamental shifted inside Maggie Torres in that moment. A lifetime of selflessness suddenly felt less like virtue and more like a prison she had built for herself, one considerate act at a time. She thought of Robert, who had always encouraged her to dream bigger, to want more for herself. "You give too much of yourself away, my amour," he used to say. "Save some for us. Save some for you." She hadn't listened then. She'd been too busy being the perfect mother, the ideal wife, the reliable daughter-in-law. But Robert was gone, and she was alone with the consequences of a lifetime spent in service to people who had apparently forgotten her value. The decision came to her with startling clarity, like desert lightning illuminating a landscape she thought she knew. She would not spend whatever years remained waiting for scraps of attention from children who had moved on without her. She would not continue to maintain a shrine to a family that existed only in her memory. With steady hands that belied the magnitude of what she was about to do, Maggie reached for her phone and dialed directory assistance. "Yes, I need the number for a real estate agent," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Someone who can help me sell my house today." The operator connected her to Morrison Realty, and when a professional male voice answered, "Jake Morrison speaking. How can I help you today?" Maggie felt the last of her hesitation evaporate like morning dew in the desert sun. "Mr. Morrison, my name is Margaret Torres, and I need to list my house for sale. This afternoon, if possible." She paused, looking around at the walls that held 55 years of memories. "I'm finally ready to start living for myself." Jake Morrison arrived at 2:30 p.m. sharp, just as he'd promised. Maggie watched from her living room window as he parked his silver Lexus in her driveway, noting the way he straightened his tie before walking to her front door. She'd spent the hours since their phone conversation in a strange state of suspended animation, part terror, part exhilaration, all determination. When the doorbell chimed, she opened it to find a man in his mid-40s, with kind eyes and an easy smile. He wore a navy suit that spoke of success without ostentation, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd navigated countless difficult conversations. "Mrs. Torres?" "Jake Morrison. Thank you for calling Morrison Realty today." "Come in, please." Maggie stepped aside, suddenly acutely aware of her house through a stranger's eyes. "Can I offer you something to drink? Coffee? Water?" "Water would be great, thank you." He followed her to the kitchen, his trained gaze already cataloging details. The spotless countertops, the high-end appliances that had been Robert's pride when they'd remodeled 15 years ago, the abundance of natural light streaming through the large windows. As she handed him a glass, Jake pulled out his tablet. "So tell me about your timeline. You mentioned this afternoon on the phone. Are you facing any kind of emergency situation?" Maggie settled into her favorite kitchen chair, the one where she'd sat for thousands of meals, homework sessions, and heart-to-heart conversations. "No emergency? Just clarity. I'm 80 years old today, and I've decided I don't want to spend whatever time I have left waiting around in a house that's too big for memories that don't visit anymore." Jake's stylus paused over his screen. There was something in his expression, recognition, perhaps, that told her he understood more than most people would about family disappointments. "Your children live out of state?" "Scattered to the four winds," she said with a bitter smile. "Seattle, Denver, New York, and one here in Phoenix who might as well be on the moon for all I see of him." "I have 2 teenagers who live with their mother in Scottsdale," Jake offered quietly. "I see them every other weekend if I'm lucky. Sometimes family is complicated." Something loosened in Maggie's chest. She'd been bracing herself for judgment, for someone to tell her she was being hasty or unreasonable. Instead, she'd found an unexpected ally. "Shall we do a walkthrough?" Jake asked. "I'd love to hear about the house while we look around." They started in the living room, where Jake admired the soaring ceilings and abundant natural light, while Maggie found herself narrating the life she'd built within these walls. "Robert and I designed this room for entertaining. Every birthday, every holiday, every celebration happened right here. I used to set up a kids' table over there by the window, and the adults would sit around the dining room table." Her voice trailed off as they moved through the space. In the master bedroom, she mentioned the sleepless nights she'd spent walking a colicky baby Mickey. In David's old room, she pointed out the pencil marks on the closet wall, where he'd calculated baseball statistics. Carmen's room still held the border of dancing ballerinas that they'd put up for her 7th birthday, and Sophia's room bore the evidence of her teenage rebellion, walls painted black with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. "You have beautiful children," Jake said, studying the family photos that lined the hallway. "I did," Maggie replied. "I'm not sure what I have now." In the kitchen, Jake opened cabinets and tested faucets, while Maggie explained the remodel that had cost them a year's worth of savings, but had given her the space to cook for an army whenever everyone came home. The formal dining room showcased her good china, service for 12 that hadn't been used since Robert's funeral. "This is remarkable craftsmanship," Jake noted, running his hand along the built-in hutch. "Custom work?" "Robert built it himself. He was handy that way. Said we couldn't afford to buy quality, so he'd make it instead." Pride and grief roared in her voice. They ended the tour in the backyard, where Jake whistled appreciatively at the landscape. The pool sparkled in the afternoon sun, surrounded by mature citrus trees and the rose garden that had been Maggie's morning ritual for 30 years. Mrs. Torres, I have to be honest with you. This is an exceptional property. Prime location, immaculate condition, beautiful upgrades. In today's market, you're looking at somewhere between $750,000 and $850,000. The number hit Maggie like a physical blow. She'd never really thought about the house's value. It had simply been home. That much? Desert living is in high demand, especially properties with this much character and space. The question is, what's your timeline? Because if you want to move quickly, and I mean within the next few weeks, I'd recommend pricing it at $725,000. That'll generate immediate interest and probably multiple offers. Maggie stared at her roses, processing the magnitude of what she was contemplating. $750,000. Enough to buy a nice condo somewhere, maybe travel a little, certainly enough to stop worrying about finances for the rest of her life. Let's do it, she said. Are you sure? This is a big decision. And, Mr. Morrison, I've spent the last 5 years maintaining this house like a museum for people who don't visit. I water these roses every morning and keep those bedrooms clean just in case one of my children decides to come home. But they have homes of their own now, and I'm tired of living in the past. Jake nodded slowly. Okay then. I'll need some paperwork from you, and I'd like to bring a photographer out tomorrow morning to get this listed by tomorrow evening. Is that too fast? Not fast enough, Maggie said firmly. As Jake prepared his camera for some preliminary photos, the front door opened without warning. Maggie froze. None of her children had keys anymore, except, Mom, what's going on? There's a strange car in the driveway and... The voice belonged to Eleanor Kowalski, her next-door neighbor and closest friend. At 78, Ellie possessed the energy of someone 20 years younger and the tactlessness of someone who'd earned the right to speak her mind. Ellie appeared in the backyard, her silver hair pulled into its customary ponytail, wearing gardening clothes and a suspicious expression. Her eyes moved from Maggie to Jake and back again. Ellie, this is Jake Morrison. He's a real estate agent. Jake, this is my neighbor, Eleanor Kowalski. Real estate agent? Ellie's voice climbed an octave. Maggie, what's going on? I'm selling the house. Ellie stared at her for a long moment, then threw back her head and laughed, a sound of pure delight that echoed off the pool's surface. It's about damn time. Good for you, honey. Good for you. Jake looked between the two women, clearly trying to process the reaction. Don't look so shocked, young man, Ellie said, settling into one of the patio chairs uninvited. I've been telling Maggie for months that she needs to stop waiting around for those ungrateful children of hers to remember she exists. Today's her 80th birthday, by the way, and not one of them has called. The judgment in Jake's expression shifted to something that looked like admiration. Happy birthday, Mrs. Torres. Thank you. It's turning out to be more eventful than I expected. Where will you go? Ellie asked. I don't know yet. Somewhere warmer in the winter, maybe. Or one of those active senior communities. I'm 80, not dead. Maybe it's time I started acting like it. Jake finished his preliminary work as the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in shades of coral and gold. They scheduled the professional photography for the next morning, and Jake promised to have the listing live by evening. One last question, he said as he prepared to leave. Have you thought about how you'll tell your family? Maggie exchanged a look with Ellie, who was grinning like a cat with cream. I figured they'll find out when they find out, They didn't remember my birthday. Maybe they won't remember to check real estate listings either. After Jake left, Ellie insisted on opening a bottle of wine to celebrate. They sat on the patio as darkness fell, talking about possibilities and futures instead of regrets and the past. It was just past 9 p.m. when Maggie's phone rang. The caller ID made her stomach clench. Mickey. Mom, I just saw there's a listing online. Is this some kind of mistake? It says our house is for sale. Maggie met Ellie's encouraging gaze and smiled. No mistake, Mijo. Happy birthday to me. The silence that followed Maggie's declaration stretched between mother and son like a chasm. She could hear Mickey breathing heavily on the other end, could picture him running his hands through his hair the way he'd done since childhood when overwhelmed. Mom, what the hell? What are you doing? You can't just sell the house. That's our home. No, Mijo, Maggie said quietly, settling back into her patio chair while Ellie watched with obvious approval. It's my house. It stopped being your home when you stopped coming home. The line went quiet except for Mickey's ragged breathing. Then, I'm coming over. Not tonight, Mickey, and not if you've been drinking. The click of the disconnected call echoed in the desert evening. Within minutes, her phone was buzzing again. This time, the caller ID showed David's number. Let me guess, Maggie said without preamble. Mickey called you. Mom, what's going on? David's voice carried the crisp efficiency that had made him successful in corporate America and emotionally distant from his family. Mickey's rambling about the house being for sale. He's obviously been drinking again, so I figured he's not wrong this time. I listed it today. The silence on David's end was different from Mickey's, calculated rather than shocked. She could practically hear the gears turning in his analytical mind, sorting through problems and solutions with the same detachment he brought to quarterly reports. Okay, he said finally. What's the real issue here? Are you having financial problems? Because if you need money, you know you can. This isn't about money, David. Then what? Are you sick? Is there something you're not telling us? The assumption that her decision must stem from crisis rather than choice struck Maggie like a physical blow. Even now, her eldest son couldn't conceive that she might be acting from her own agency rather than necessity. I'm not sick. I'm tired. There's a difference. Tired of what? Of being forgotten. Of maintaining a museum for people who don't visit. Of celebrating your birthdays alone and having mine pass unnoticed. Another pause. When David spoke again, his voice had shifted slightly, carrying the first hint of uncertainty she'd heard from him in years. Mom, it's been a busy month. It's been a busy 18 years, David. Ever since you left for college and decided Arizona was something to escape from, rather than return to. That's not fair, isn't it? When was the last time you called just to talk? Not because you needed something, not because there was a crisis, but just to ask how I'm doing. The question hung between them like an accusation. Maggie could hear typing in the background. Even during this conversation, David was multitasking, probably checking email or reviewing reports. Look, I'll fly down this weekend and we can discuss this rationally. There's no need to make any hasty decisions. I'm 80 years old, David. How much time do you think I have left for decisions that aren't hasty? Before he could respond, call waiting interrupted. Carmen's name appeared on the screen. I have to take this, Maggie said. But David? Don't bother flying down unless you're prepared to actually see me, not just manage me. She switched to Carmen's call, bracing herself for a different kind of conversation. "Mama!" Carmen's voice was thick with tears. "Mickey called me. Please tell me this is some kind of mistake." Of all her children, Carmen had always been the most emotionally attuned, the one who still called her Mama in moments of stress. She was also the one most likely to internalize guilt, to blame herself for family problems that existed long before she had any power to solve them. "It's not a mistake, Mija." "But why? I don't understand. Is it because I couldn't visit last month when James had his seizure? Because you know I wanted to come, but with his therapy schedule and the girls' school." "Carmen, breathe." Maggie's voice gentled automatically. Even in her own crisis, her maternal instincts kicked in. "This isn't about any one thing, it's about everything." "What do you mean? When was the last time you visited? Really visited? Not just dropped by during a crisis or called while rushing between appointments?" Carmen's sob was audible. "I know I've been a terrible daughter. I know I should call more, visit more, but James needs so much attention, and Mark's deployment schedule, and the girls. I'm not asking you to choose between your family and me, Carmen. I'm telling you that you already did choose, and I understand why. But I'm tired of pretending it doesn't hurt. Mama, please. We can fix this. I can do better, I promise. Just don't sell the house, please. What about Christmas? What about the grandchildren's memories?" The mention of grandchildren stung. Carmen's 3 kids, including James, whose special needs demanded constant attention, had been strangers to Maggie for years. They knew her as the lady who sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, not as the grandmother who had once been central to their lives. "What memories, Carmen? When was the last time you brought the children here for Christmas? 2 years ago? 3? We've been trying to establish traditions at our own house. And I understand that. I do. But understanding doesn't make it hurt less." After Carmen dissolved into guilt-ridden promises to visit soon, Maggie found herself staring at her phone, dreading the next call she knew would come. She didn't have to wait long. Sophia's number appeared just as Ellie was refilling their wine glasses. "This should be interesting," Maggie murmured, accepting the glass. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mom." Sophia's voice was clipped, professional. No tears, no panic, just irritation. "I just got off a conference call with David and Carmen. What's this nonsense about selling the house?" "Hello to you too, Sophia. How are you? How's Thomas?" "Don't deflect. This is serious. You can't just make major financial decisions without consulting the family." "Actually, I can. It's my house. But have you thought about the implications? Property taxes, capital gains, your long-term care needs? There are legal considerations you probably haven't." "I'm not senile, Sophia. I didn't say you were. But this seems impulsive. Emotional. Not well-reasoned." Maggie laughed, the sound sharp in the evening air. "And what would you know about emotion, Mija? When was the last time you showed any? That's not fair." "Fair? You want to talk about fair?" "Fair would be one of my 4 children, remembering that today is my 80th birthday. Fair would be a phone call that isn't about a crisis or a favor. Fair would be feeling like I matter to the people I spent my life raising." For the first time, Sophia's composure cracked. "It's your birthday? Today? October 15th. Same as every year for the past 8 decades. The silence stretched long enough that Maggie wondered if the call had dropped. When Sophia spoke again, her voice was smaller, younger. I had it in my calendar. Work has been insane, and Thomas and I have been discussing the partnership opportunity, and I thought it was next week. It's always something, isn't it? Work, deadlines, opportunities. Life is what happens while you're making other plans, Sophia. Your father used to say that. Don't bring Dad into this. Why not? He's the one who taught me that family should come first. Apparently that lesson didn't stick with any of you. 3 hours later, Maggie's phone finally fell silent. She and Ellie sat on the patio, the bottle of wine empty between them, processing the emotional carnage of the evening. Well, Ellie said eventually, that went about as well as expected. David wants to fly down to manage the situation. Carmen's drowning in guilt and making promises she won't keep. Sophia's treating it like a legal case she needs to win. And Mickey? Mickey hung up and hasn't called back. He's probably drinking himself into oblivion as we speak. Ellie reached over and squeezed Maggie's hand. You know they're going to gang up on you, right? Probably coordinate their attacks. Let them. I'm not changing my mind. Good, because you know what I think? I think they need this wake-up call. They've been taking you for granted for so long, they forgot you're a person with feelings and needs. Maggie's phone buzzed with a text message. David again. Booked a flight. Arriving Thursday afternoon. We'll figure this out. She showed the message to Ellie, who snorted with laughter. We'll figure this out, Ellie repeated mockingly. We. As if he gets a vote. He's used to being in charge. They all are, in their own ways. Carmen thinks she can guilt me into backing down. Sophia thinks she can lawyer me into submission, and David thinks he can CEO his way through it. And Mickey? Maggie stared at her roses, barely visible in the gathering darkness. Mickey's the one who might actually understand. He's made his share of impulsive decisions. The question is whether he's sober enough to have a rational conversation. As if summoned by her words, headlights swept across her driveway. A battered pickup truck pulled in behind Jake's abandoned business card on her doorstep, and Mickey stumbled out. Speak of the devil, Ellie muttered. Mickey approached the patio unsteadily, his clothes wrinkled, his hair disheveled. At 50, he still carried traces of the high school football star he'd once been, but addiction and disappointment had carved harsh lines around his eyes. Mom, he said, his voice thick with alcohol and emotion. We need to talk. Maggie stood slowly, her hand finding Ellie's shoulder for support. Not tonight, Mickey. I can smell the whiskey from here. Mom, please. Mickey swayed slightly, gripping the patio railing. I know I screwed up, okay? I know I've been absent, but you can't sell the house. This is where Dad is. This is where we all... This is home. For who? The question came out sharper than Maggie intended. When was the last time you were here for something other than asking for money or a place to crash between apartments? Mickey's face crumpled. Even in the dim patio lighting, she could see the boy he'd once been, her golden child, the one who'd made her laugh until her sides ached, who'd brought her wildflowers from the desert and told her she was the most beautiful mom in the world. I'll get clean, he said, his voice breaking. I promise. I'll go to meetings, get a job, make this right. Just Don't take away the only thing that feels like family. Ellie squeezed Maggie's hand. Maybe we should call it a night, honey. You heard her, Maggie said to Mickey. Go home. Sleep it off. We'll talk when you're sober. Mickey stood there for a long moment, swaying slightly, before stumbling back to his truck. Maggie watched him drive away, her heart breaking a little more with each erratic movement of his taillights. Think he'll make it home okay? Ellie asked. He always has before, Maggie said, but her voice carried no confidence. David's flight landed at Sky Harbor on Thursday afternoon with military precision. Maggie watched from her living room window as his rental car, a spotless white sedan that screamed business traveler, pulled into her driveway at exactly 3:47 p.m. He emerged wearing a crisp button-down shirt and khakis, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled despite the flight, carrying himself with the same controlled authority that had made him successful and emotionally unreachable. He knocked rather than using the doorbell, 3 sharp raps that somehow managed to sound impatient. David. Maggie opened the door, studying her eldest son. At 58, he looked like Robert had in his prime, but where Robert's confidence had been warm and inclusive, David's felt cold and calculating. Mom. He stepped inside, his gaze immediately cataloging changes. The fresh flowers Jake had suggested, the family photos she'd removed from prominent display, the subtle signs that the house was being prepared for sale. You look well. Did you expect otherwise? Honestly, I wasn't sure what to expect. He settled onto the couch without invitation, pulling out his phone to check messages. I've been researching elder care options. There are some excellent assisted living facilities in Seattle. Close to me, so I could visit regularly. I don't need assisted living. Maybe not now, but this house is too big for one person. The maintenance alone gets done. I have a landscaper, a pool service, a handyman for repairs. I'm not helpless, David. He looked up from his phone for the first time since arriving. I didn't say you were, but selling the house seems extreme. If you're lonely, there are other solutions. Technology can help you stay connected. Video calls, social media. I'm not a problem to be solved with an app. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? You've been here 15 minutes, and you're already planning my life, organizing my future, managing my decisions, just like always. David's jaw tightened. Someone has to be practical. Mickey's a mess. Carmen's overwhelmed with her own family. Sophia's what? Busy. Successful. She doesn't have time for... He caught himself. For me. You can say it, David. She doesn't have time for me. None of you do. The sound of another car in the driveway saved them from the conversation's inevitable destination. Carmen's minivan, a battle-scarred Honda Odyssey with Colorado plates, pulled up behind David's rental. Maggie watched her middle daughter emerge, looking frazzled and exhausted. At 55, Carmen carried the weight of her responsibilities in her hunched shoulders and the permanent worry lines around her eyes. Carmen's here, Maggie announced. David's relief was palpable. Good. Maybe she can talk some sense into you. Carmen knocked softly before entering, her arms immediately opening for a hug that Maggie found herself accepting despite her anger. Carmen smelled like lavender fabric softener and the faint antiseptic of medical facilities. a combination that spoke to her life shuttling between home and her son's various therapy appointments. "Mama," Carmen whispered, holding on longer than usual. "I'm so sorry about your birthday. I'm sorry about everything." "I know, Misha." Carmen pulled back, her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and guilt. "The house looks beautiful. It always does." "Jake brought flowers," Maggie said. "Staging, he called it." "Right, the real estate agent." Carmen's voice caught. "I still can't believe this is really happening." David stood, switching into his corporate leadership mode. "Which is why we need to discuss this rationally. Mom, I've been thinking about your options." "Our options?" Carmen interrupted. "This affects all of us." "No," Maggie said firmly. "This affects me. You all made your choices years ago. Your careers, your families, your lives away from here. This is my choice." The front door opened again without warning, and Sophia swept in like a force of nature. She wore a black power suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, her phone already pressed to her ear. "I'll call you back," she said into the phone, then looked around the room with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to taking control. "So, here we are." Sophia's presence changed the room's dynamic immediately. At 52, she radiated the kind of confidence that came from years of winning arguments for a living. She kissed Maggie's cheek perfunctorily before settling into Robert's old recliner as if claiming territory. "Have you consulted a financial advisor about the tax implications?" she asked without preamble. "Because the capital gains alone—" "Sophia," Carmen said weakly, "maybe we should—" "Should what? Pretend this makes sense?" "Mom, I ran some numbers on the flight down. Between capital gains taxes and the cost of relocating, you're looking at significant financial losses, not to mention the emotional cost to the family." "What family?" The words escaped before Maggie could stop them. The room fell silent. Sophia's composure flickered for just a moment, revealing something that might have been hurt. "That's not fair," David said. "Isn't it? When was the last time we were all in this room together? Robert's funeral? And before that—" "Life gets complicated when you're an adult," Sophia said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier authority. "Life was complicated when you were children, too. I've still made time." Carmen started crying, soft, guilt-ridden tears that she tried to hide behind her hands. David began pacing, his phone buzzing with messages he kept glancing at. Sophia stared at the family photos still scattered on the coffee table, her lawyer's mask slipping to reveal the uncertain girl she'd once been. "Look," David said finally, "we're all here now. That has to count for something. You're here because I forced your hand. Because I did something so drastic you couldn't ignore it anymore." "That's not—" Sophia started. "When was the last time any of you visited? Not for a crisis, not because you needed something, but just to visit." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Carmen wiped her eyes, looking miserable. David stopped pacing, but couldn't meet Maggie's gaze. Sophia's phone buzzed, and she reflexively reached for it before catching herself. "I rest my case," Maggie said. "We're busy, Mom," Sophia said defensively. "We have careers, responsibilities." "I had responsibilities, too. 4 of them. But I never forgot what mattered most." "Times were different then," David said. "Families stayed closer together. Now, with global careers and—" "Excuses." Maggie's voice cut through his explanation. "That's all I hear from any of you anymore. Excuses for why you can't call, can't visit, can't remember the woman who raised you." Carmen's sobs grew louder. I try, Mama. I really do. But James needs so much care, and the girls have their activities, and Mark's deployment schedule. I know you try, Carmen. But trying isn't the same as succeeding. The cruelty of the words surprised even Maggie, but she didn't take them back. Sometimes truth had to be cruel to be heard. Sophia's phone rang, and this time she answered it. Not now, she said curtly, hanging up. Mom, what do you want from us? Specific, actionable items? What would it take for you to reconsider this decision? I want you to see me, Maggie said simply, not as a problem to be managed or a responsibility to be checked off your lists. I want you to see me as a person who still has thoughts and feelings and dreams, who still matters. You do matter, David said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Do I? When was the last time any of you asked about my dreams? My plans? My hopes for whatever years I have left? Another uncomfortable silence. I didn't think so. Maggie stood, suddenly feeling every one of her 80 years. The photographer will be here tomorrow morning for the final pictures. The listing goes live tomorrow evening. You're welcome to stay in your old rooms tonight if you want. God knows they're ready for you. She walked toward her bedroom, then paused. Oh, and David? Mickey showed up last night, drunk and begging me not to sell. Even in his current state, he was the only one who seemed to understand what this house actually means. The door to her bedroom closed with a soft click, leaving her 3 eldest children to contemplate the ruins of their family in the house where it had all begun. Maggie woke before dawn, as she had for 60 years. Her bedroom felt smaller with the weight of her children's presence in the house. David in his old room, Carmen in hers, Sophia claiming the guest room with the firmness of someone accustomed to the best accommodations. The silence from Mickey's room across the hall suggested he'd never made it home the night before. She dressed quietly and slipped out to tend her roses, finding solace in the familiar ritual. The October morning carried the promise of another scorching day, but for now the air held a blessed coolness that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with the desert all those years ago. Figured I'd find you out here. Maggie looked up to see Carmen standing in the doorway, still in her pajamas, old flannel pants and one of Mark's army t-shirts. Her daughter looked older in the morning light, worn down by responsibilities that had aged her beyond her 55 years. Coffee's on, Maggie said, not pausing in her watering. Carmen fetched 2 mugs and settled on the patio steps, watching her mother work. I remember helping you plant these. I must have been 7 or 8. You were 6. Mickey had just been born, and you were convinced he was getting all the attention. Maggie moved to the next bush, the Rosa de Guadalupe that bloomed pink and fragrant. You asked if we could plant something that would be just ours. I'd forgotten that. Carmen's voice was soft with memory. I thought you'd forgotten too. I forget grocery lists and doctor's appointments. I don't forget the important things. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, mother and daughter connected by shared memory and the grief of time passing. Mama, Carmen said finally, I know you think we don't care, but it's not that simple. Isn't it? James's autism spectrum disorder. It's gotten more complex as he's gotten older. He's 15 now, and some days... Carmen's voice broke slightly. Some days I feel like I'm drowning. Mark tries to help when he's not deployed. But military schedules don't care about family crises. And the girls need attention too, but there's only so much of me to go around. Maggie set down her watering can and really looked at her daughter. Carmen had always been the caretaker, even as a child, the one who bandaged skinned knees and mediated sibling fights. But somewhere along the way, the caretaking had become a burden that consumed her. "When was the last time you did something just for yourself?" Maggie asked. Carmen laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I can't remember. Maybe before James was born? I used to paint, watercolors. Had a little easel set up in the corner of the bedroom." "What happened to it?" "Gave it away during one of our moves. No time for hobbies when you're managing therapy schedules and IEP meetings and being everything to everyone except yourself. Someone has to." "No," Maggie said firmly. "Someone doesn't have to. That's what I'm learning, Mija. Sometimes someone has to stop." The sound of footsteps interrupted them. David emerged from the house, already dressed for the day in pressed khakis and a polo shirt, his phone in one hand and a coffee mug in the other. "Morning," he said absently, scrolling through emails. "I've been thinking about the logistics of this situation. If you're really determined to downsize, there are better ways to—" "David," Carmen said quietly, "put the phone away." "I'm just checking." "Put it away." Something in Carmen's tone made David look up, really seeing his sister and mother for the first time that morning. The phone went into his pocket, though his fingers twitched toward it several times. "Good," Maggie said. "Now sit down." David perched on the edge of a patio chair, his body language suggesting he was prepared to bolt at the first opportunity. "When did this become normal for you?" Maggie asked. "When did what become normal?" "Being here but not being here. Having a conversation while managing your inbox. It's called multitasking, Mom. It's how business works in the modern world." "And how does family work in the modern world?" David's jaw tightened. "That's not fair. I flew down here, didn't I? I rearranged my entire schedule to deal with this crisis you've created." "Crisis I've created," Maggie repeated slowly. "Is that what you think this is? A crisis I'm manufacturing to get attention?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Sophia appeared in the doorway, looking polished even in casual clothes. Designer jeans and a silk blouse that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries. Her phone was already in her hand. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, not sounding sorry at all, "but I need to take this call. Client emergency." "No," Maggie said. Sophia paused, finger hovering over the answer button. "Excuse me?" "I said no. No phones. No clients. No emergencies that can't wait 30 minutes. Mom, this is a multi-million-dollar merger. And this is your family. Or what's left of it." Sophia stared at her mother for a long moment, then declined the call. The phone went into her purse with obvious reluctance. "Thank you," Maggie said. "Now, I want to show you all something." She led them into the house, to the dining room where she'd spent the previous evening sorting through decades of accumulated memories. The formal table was covered with photo albums, cards, financial records, and mementos that told the story of a family's gradual dissolution. "This," she said, gesturing to one stack, "is every birthday card you've sent me over the past 10 years. 13 cards total, between the 4 of you." Carmen's face crumpled. David's expression grew defensive. Sophia remained stoically unreadable. "And this," Maggie continued, moving to another pile, "is a record of every loan I've made to my children since your father died. $23,000 to David for his divorce lawyer, $15,000 to Carmen for James's private therapy, $8,000 to Sophia for her bar exam costs." $37,000 to Mickey for various emergencies, none of which were actually emergencies. We didn't ask you to keep track, Sophia began. 18,000 of which has been repaid, Maggie continued as if Sophia hadn't spoken. All of it from David, because he's the only one who treats debts like actual obligations. Mom, David said uncomfortably. I didn't know the others hadn't. Of course you didn't, because none of you talk to each other anymore either. When was the last time the four of you were in the same room? Robert's funeral? The silence that followed was answer enough. Maggie picked up a photo album, opening it to a page filled with pictures from Mickey's high school graduation. Look at this family. Look at how happy we were. Look at how connected. The photo showed a younger Maggie and Robert surrounded by their 4 children, all dressed up and beaming with pride. Mickey in his cap and gown, David home from his freshman year at ASU, Carmen and Sophia flanking their baby brother with genuine affection. What happened to us? Carmen whispered. Life, Sophia said pragmatically. We grew up. We moved away. We built our own families. No, Maggie said sharply. You abandoned this family. There's a difference. She turned the page, revealing photos from Carmen's wedding. Robert walking his daughter down the aisle, the whole family dancing at the reception, Maggie holding infant James while the new parents slow danced. This was 12 years ago, Maggie said. When was the last time we were all together for something happy, something that wasn't a funeral or a crisis? Another uncomfortable silence. I'll tell you when, Maggie continued. James's baptism, 11 years ago. That was the last time this family celebrated anything together. David cleared his throat. Mom, we've all been busy. Yes, I know. You're all very important, very successful, very busy people. Maggie's voice carried a bitter edge. But you know what? I was busy too. I worked 2 jobs while raising you. I took care of your father through 2 heart attacks. I survived cancer. I buried my parents, my husband, my dreams of what this family could be. But I was never too busy for my children. She opened another album, this one filled with recent photos, mostly of her alone, at a neighbor's barbecue, at church functions, at her book club, a life carefully constructed around the absence of her children. This is my life now, she said. 80 years old, and I'm making new friends because my old friends are my children, and my children are strangers. Carmen was crying openly now. David stared at the photos with something that might have been recognition. Sophia's composure had finally cracked completely. I want to try family therapy, Carmen said suddenly. All of us. Together. Therapy? David looked skeptical. I don't think... Yes, Sophia said quietly, surprising everyone. Carmen's right. We need help. Professional help. Maggie looked at her 3 eldest children, really looked at them, and saw not the successful adults they'd become, but the frightened children they'd once been when their world felt uncertain. Jake Morrison is bringing potential buyers by this afternoon, she said finally. The listing goes live tonight. But if you're serious about therapy, if you're willing to do the work, real work, not just talking, I'll consider postponing the sale. For how long? David asked. Long enough to see if there's anything left worth saving. As if summoned by the emotional gravity of the moment, the front door opened and Mickey stumbled in, wearing yesterday's clothes and looking like he'd slept in his truck. Family meeting? He asked, taking in the scene. Good, because I have something to say. Mickey stood in the doorway of the dining room, swaying slightly, his eyes bloodshot and his hair sticking up at odd angles. He looked like he'd aged a decade overnight, the remnants of his former athletic build now softened by years of self-destruction. But his gaze was sharper than it had been in months, focused with the clarity that sometimes came to addicts in moments of crisis. "You want to know about family?" he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "You want to know about being busy, about having responsibilities?" He laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "I've been living 15 minutes away from this house for 2 years, and I've been here maybe 10 times. Not because I was busy. Because I was ashamed." The room fell silent. Maggie watched her youngest son, her baby, the one who'd never quite grown up, with a mixture of heartbreak and hope. "Ashamed of what, Mijo?" she asked gently. "Of what I became. Of what I didn't become." Mickey moved unsteadily to the table, picking up one of the photo albums. His hands shook as he opened it to a page showing his high school football team. "Remember this? Senior year, state champions, full scholarship to ASU. You and Dad were so proud." "We were always proud of you," Maggie said. "Were you proud when I blew out my knee freshman year? When I lost the scholarship? When I started taking pills for the pain and couldn't stop?" His voice cracked. "Were you proud when I got kicked out of school, when I moved back home at 21 and spent 2 years on your couch feeling sorry for myself?" David shifted uncomfortably. "Mickey, that was 30 years ago." "Shut up, David." The words came out with surprising force. "Just shut up. You think because you escaped to Seattle and made your fortune that you get to judge the rest of us? You think because you send money instead of showing up that you're somehow better? I never said. You didn't have to. It's in every look, every conversation. Poor Mickey, the family fuck-up. Poor Mickey can't get his life together. Poor Mickey, still asking Mommy for money at 50 years old." Sophia stepped forward. "Mickey, you're obviously not well. Maybe you should." "Maybe I should what? Go to rehab? Get clean? Find a job? Become a productive member of society?" Mickey's laugh was bitter. "You think I haven't tried? You think I haven't spent the last 30 years trying to become someone you could all be proud of again?" He turned to the window, looking out at the backyard where he'd once played catch with Robert, where he'd taught neighborhood kids to throw spirals, where he'd dreamed of NFL glory before reality intervened. "I've been to rehab 4 times, he said quietly. 4 times. Mom paid for 3 of them. The 4th time, I sold her grandmother's ring to cover the costs. The one Dad gave her for their 25th anniversary." Maggie's intake of breath was audible. Carmen's hand flew to her mouth. Even Sophia looked shocked. "You never told us," David said. "Why would I? So you could all feel even sorrier for me? So you could have another reason to avoid coming home?" Mickey turned back to face them, tears streaming down his face. "I sold our mother's ring, and she never said a word. Never made me feel guilty about it. Just quietly stopped wearing rings altogether." "Mickey," Maggie whispered. "No, Mom, let me finish. You want to know why I drink? It's not because of the pain anymore. It's because every day I wake up and remember that I'm the reason this family fell apart. I'm the one you all had to worry about, had to make excuses for, had to be embarrassed by. I'm why Christmas became awkward and why nobody wants to bring their kids around." "That's not true," Carmen said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it? When was the last time any of you invited me to your homes? When was the last time you included me in family plans? When was the last time you talked about me without lowering your voice?" Mickey's voice rose with each question. "I became the family secret, the brother you don't mention to your friends, the uncle your kids don't really know." He picked up another photo, this one from Carmen's wedding. In it, Mickey stood beside his sister, clean-shaven and sober, beaming with genuine happiness. This was 12 years ago. I was clean then. 6 months sober, working construction, had my own apartment. Remember? I gave a speech at your reception, Carmen, made everyone laugh. Dad told me he was proud of me. Carmen nodded, tears flowing freely now. That lasted 8 months. 8 months of being the son you wanted, the brother you deserved. And then what happened? He looked around the room. Life happened. Dad had his first heart attack, and I couldn't handle seeing him in that hospital bed. Couldn't handle the thought of losing him. So I took a drink. Just one drink to calm my nerves. Addiction isn't your fault, Carmen said. The addiction isn't, but the choices are. And I chose, over and over again, to be the problem instead of part of the solution. I chose pills over family dinners. I chose beer over birthday calls. I chose feeling sorry for myself over showing up for the people who loved me. Mickey walked to where Maggie sat, dropping to his knees beside her chair like a child seeking absolution. Mom, I know you're selling this house because of us. Because we all abandoned you in different ways. David with his success, Carmen with her guilt, Sophia with her ambition, but I'm the worst. Because I never even had a good excuse. I was just broken. And instead of fixing myself, I kept breaking everyone else. Maggie reached out to touch his face, her weathered hands gentle against his stubbled cheek. Me, Joe. I'm checking into Desert Valley tomorrow, he said. The long-term program. 90 days minimum. I've already called them. The room went dead silent. Desert Valley was the most intensive addiction treatment center in Arizona, known for its no-nonsense approach and low tolerance for relapse. Mickey, Sophia said carefully, those programs are expensive. I'm paying for it myself, he said, still looking at his mother. I sold my truck this morning. It's not enough for the full program, but it's a start. And I'm going whether you sell the house or not, whether this family gets back together or not. Because I can't keep being the reason you're all miserable. You're not the reason, David started. Yes, I am. And you know what? So are all of you. Sophia, you're so busy proving you don't need this family that you forgot you might want it. David, you're so afraid of being hurt that you don't let anyone close enough to matter. Carmen, you're so guilty about everything that you can't enjoy anything. He stood up, swaying but determined. And Mom, you're so busy taking care of everyone else that you forgot to take care of yourself. That's why you're selling the house. Not because we don't love you, but because we never learned how to show it without making it about us. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Carmen's quiet sobs and the distant hum of traffic on the freeway. I don't know if I can get clean this time, Mickey continued. I don't know if I can become the man Dad wanted me to be, or the son you deserve, but I know I can't keep being the man I am. He walked toward the front door, then paused. Sophia, you asked Mom what it would take for her to keep the house? I'll tell you what it would take. It would take all of us learning how to be a family again. Not the family we were, because that's gone. But maybe we could learn to be the family we should have been all along. The front door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving the 4 remaining Torres family members to sit with the weight of his words. Outside, they could hear Mickey's truck struggling to start, the same battered Ford he'd apparently just claimed to have sold. Finally, the engine caught, and he drove away, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his desperation and the echo of truths none of them had been brave enough to speak. He sold his truck to pay for rehab, Carmen whispered, but he just drove away in it. He lied, Sophia said, but without her usual judgment. He lied about selling it. No, Maggie said quietly, her eyes still fixed on the empty doorway. He didn't lie. He's planning to sell it. Today. Right now. Before he can change his mind. David pulled out his phone. I'll call him. Tell him we'll help with the cost. No. Maggie's voice was firm. Let him do this himself. Let him have the dignity of paying his own way. But if he needs money, He doesn't need money, David. He needs to know that he can save himself, that he's strong enough to choose recovery over comfort, pride over enabling. Maggie stood slowly, her joints protesting. Mickey just did something none of the rest of you have done yet. What's that? Sophia asked. He told the truth about what this family has become. Now the question is, what are we going to do about it? The silence that followed Mickey's departure felt different from the uncomfortable pauses that had punctuated their conversations over the past 2 days. This silence carried weight, the heaviness of truth finally spoken and wounds finally acknowledged. Carmen was the first to break it. We need help, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Professional help. All of us. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that made him look younger, more vulnerable. I've never believed in therapy. Thought it was self-indulgent. Yeah, well, Sophia said, her lawyer's composure completely abandoned. Apparently believing we could figure this out ourselves hasn't worked out so well. Maggie studied her 3 eldest children, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Not as the successful adults they'd become, nor as the disappointments she'd sometimes felt them to be, but as people struggling with their own pain, their own failures, their own fears. I'll make some calls, Carmen said, pulling out her phone. There's a therapist in Denver who specializes in family systems, Dr. Patricia Weiss. She might know someone here, or maybe she could do video sessions. I have a better idea, Sophia said, surprising everyone. I know Dr. Weiss. Professionally. She consulted on a custody case I handled last year. She's brilliant, and she's based in Phoenix now. She relocated here 6 months ago. You'd be okay with therapy? Maggie asked David, genuinely curious. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photo albums scattered across the dining room table. I used to think success meant not needing anyone, but watching Mickey just now, hearing him take responsibility for his choices while I've been making excuses for mine. He looked up at his mother. If there's a chance to fix this, I want to try. Dr. Patricia Weiss's office was located in a converted house in central Phoenix, its southwestern architecture softened by mature landscaping and the sound of a small fountain in the courtyard. When Maggie walked in with her 3 children 2 days later, she felt like she was surrendering to something, though whether it was defeat or hope, she couldn't say. Dr. Weiss was a woman in her early 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that missed nothing. She greeted each of them personally, her manner professional but warm, and led them to a large room with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. I want to start by acknowledging how difficult it must have been for all of you to come here, she said once they were settled. Family therapy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires courage. It requires Mickey too, Sophia said, and he's not here. No, but he'll join us when he's ready. Recovery has its own timeline, and we need to respect that. Dr. Weiss opened a leather portfolio. Margaret, you initiated this crisis by listing your house for sale. Can you tell me what you hope to accomplish? Maggie had rehearsed this moment in her mind, but sitting here with her children, the careful words she'd planned seemed inadequate. I wanted them to see me, she said simply, to remember that I'm still here, still alive, still their mother. And what was it like to feel invisible to your children? The question hit harder than Maggie expected. Devastating. Like I'd spent 55 years raising strangers. Carmen wiped her eyes. David shifted uncomfortably. Sophia stared at her hands. David? Dr. Weiss continued. What was your first reaction when you learned about the house sale? Irritation, he admitted. I thought it was impractical. Emotional rather than logical. And underneath the irritation? David was quiet for so long that Maggie wondered if he would answer. Fear, he said finally. Fear that I'd failed her somehow, but also fear that she might be what? Losing her mental capacity? Because the alternative, that she was making a rational decision based on how we'd treated her, was too uncomfortable to accept. Dr. Weiss nodded. Carmen, how did you respond? Guilt. Overwhelming guilt. Carmen's voice was thick with tears. I knew immediately that she was right, that I'd been so caught up in my own family's needs that I'd forgotten about hers. And Sophia? Sophia's legal training had taught her to be careful with words, but here, in this circle of chairs, her usual defenses seemed useless. Anger. I was angry that she was disrupting our lives, forcing us to confront this, but also angry at myself for letting it get this bad. So we have 4 people dealing with very different emotions: devastation, fear, guilt, and anger, but all stemming from the same fundamental issue. Can anyone identify what that is? We stopped being a family, Carmen said quietly. When do you think that happened? The question prompted a discussion that lasted an hour, with each family member offering different timelines. David thought it began when he left for college. Carmen believed it started after Robert's death. Sophia pointed to Mickey's addiction as the turning point. Those are all significant events, Dr. Weiss said, but I wonder if the dissolution was more gradual. Margaret, when did you first feel like you were maintaining relationships rather than enjoying them? Maggie thought carefully. After Robert's heart attack, maybe. The children rallied then, but afterward, it felt like they checked me off a list. Duty rather than desire. And you didn't express those feelings? I didn't want to be a burden. David, when did visiting home start feeling like an obligation rather than a pleasure? David winced. Probably around the same time. When Mom started treating every visit like it might be the last one, the intensity of her gratitude made me feel guilty rather than welcomed. So you stopped coming as often? Yes. Carmen, what about you? When James was diagnosed, I was so overwhelmed, and every time I talked to Mom, I felt like I should be doing more for her too. It became easier to just not call. Sophia? When I realized that every conversation became about everyone else's problems, Mom's loneliness, Mickey's addiction, Carmen's stress, David's divorce, I started avoiding family contact because it always left me feeling drained. Dr. Weiss leaned back in her chair. So we have a classic family system breakdown. Margaret sacrificing her needs to avoid being a burden, which made her children feel guilty rather than loved. David, Carmen, and Sophia pulling away to manage their guilt, which increased Margaret's sense of abandonment. And Mickey medicating his pain with substances, which gave everyone else permission to focus on his crisis, rather than the underlying family dysfunction. The room fell silent as they absorbed this analysis. The question now, Dr. Weiss continued, is whether you're all willing to do the work necessary to build something new. What kind of work? David asked. Each of you needs to make specific, measurable commitments to changing your patterns. And Margaret, you need to decide what you actually want from your children, not what you think you should want. Maggie felt her throat tighten. What do you mean? You've spent decades being the perfect mother, selfless, understanding, accommodating. But perfect mothers don't exist, and the pursuit of perfection often prevents authentic relationships. What do you actually need from your children? The question felt dangerous, like opening a door she'd kept locked for years. I need to know that I matter, that my life has meaning beyond what I've done for them. Specifically, what would that look like? Maggie took a breath. Regular contact that isn't about crisis management. Inclusion in their lives as they are now, not just memories of who they used to be. And she paused, gathering courage. I need them to see me as more than just their mother, as a person with my own interests and dreams. Dr. Weiss turned to the others. Are you hearing this? Your mother needs to be seen as a complete person, not just in the role she's played in your lives. We can do that, Carmen said quickly. Can you? Dr. Weiss challenged. Because that means asking about her book club, her gardening, her friendships. It means caring about her opinions on movies and politics and current events. It means relating to her as an adult, not just accepting care from her as children. The silence that followed was thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. I'd like each of you to make 3 specific commitments, Dr. Weiss said. Things you're willing to do differently over the next 3 months. Margaret, you'll go first, then David, Carmen, and Sophia. Maggie felt the weight of the moment. These weren't just promises, they were the terms of a new family contract. I commit to expressing my needs directly instead of hoping you'll guess them. I commit to having my own life and interests, so I'm not solely dependent on your attention. And I commit to... She paused, the words feeling foreign. To asking for help when I need it, instead of pretending I'm fine. David shifted in his chair. I commit to calling every Sunday, not to check on you but to actually talk. I commit to visiting at least 4 times a year, not for holidays but just because. And I commit to including you in my life by telling you about my work, my kids, my struggles, treating you like a friend, not just a mother. Carmen was crying again, but these tears felt different. I commit to setting boundaries with my own family so I can be present for ours. I commit to sharing both the good and the bad in my life with you, not just the crises. And I commit to bringing the children to see you, to making sure they know you as their grandmother, not just as someone who sends presents. Sophia's voice was steady but quiet. I commit to visiting every other month, staying long enough to actually connect. I commit to including you in my major life decisions, asking for your advice, not just announcing my choices. And I commit to... She paused, vulnerability creeping into her voice. To letting you mother me sometimes, instead of always trying to prove I don't need anyone. Dr. Weiss smiled for the first time that session. Those are excellent commitments. The question now is, Margaret, are you willing to take the house off the market based on these promises? Maggie looked at each of her children, seeing not the disappointments of the past but the possibilities of the future. For 3 months, she said finally. We'll try for 3 months. 6 weeks later, Maggie stood in her kitchen on a Sunday morning, waiting for David's call. It was 9:47 a.m. Arizona time, which meant 11:47 in Seattle, and David had promised to call every Sunday at noon his time. She'd learned not to expect punctuality. His first few calls had come anywhere from 11:30 to 1:15, but she'd also learned that he always called, which was more than she'd had in years. The phone rang at exactly noon Pacific time. Hi, Mom. David's voice carried a warmth that was still unfamiliar after decades of dutiful distance. How was your week? Good, she said, settling into her kitchen chair with her coffee. I joined a hiking group. We did South Mountain yesterday. You hiked South Mountain? Mom, that's... She could hear the shift in his tone, the old protective instincts kicking in. Is that safe for someone your age? David, she said gently but firmly. I'm 80, not invalid. And yes, it's safe. The group is mostly people in their 70s and 80s. We take the easy trails, and everyone watches out for everyone else. A pause. Right. Sorry, that sounds great, actually. Tell me about it. It was a small thing, this course correction, but it represented the kind of growth that had been happening in increments over the past month and a half. David was learning to see her as a capable adult rather than a fragile responsibility, while she was learning to assert her independence rather than simply accommodate his concerns. There's a woman named Janet who's 85 and has climbed every peak in Arizona, Maggie found herself saying. She's planning a trip to the Grand Canyon in the spring, and she asked if I wanted to join her. The Grand Canyon? David's voice climbed an octave before he caught himself. I mean, that sounds like an adventure. How do you feel about it? Terrified and excited, Maggie admitted, which feels about right. They talked for 45 minutes about David's teenagers, who were apparently struggling with their own identity issues, about his work on a project that was actually interesting to him for the first time in years, about a book he was reading on recommendation from his therapist. It was the kind of conversation Maggie had stopped hoping for decades ago. After they hung up, she realized she was smiling. Carmen's approach had been different, but no less meaningful. Instead of scheduled calls, she'd taken to texting photos throughout the week. Images of her son James working on a puzzle, her daughters at soccer practice, even pictures of her own rediscovered artwork. Small watercolors she'd been painting in stolen moments. Tentative at first, but growing bolder. "I'm thinking about taking a class," Carmen had confided during their last video call. "There's a community college near the base that offers evening art courses." "What does Mark think?" Maggie had asked. "He thinks it's about time," Carmen had replied with a smile that reminded Maggie of the girl she'd once been. But the real test had come 2 weeks ago when James had experienced a significant seizure that landed him in the hospital. In the past, Carmen would have handled the crisis alone, too overwhelmed to reach out until after the emergency had passed. This time, she'd called Maggie from the hospital. "I know you can't do anything from Arizona," she'd said, her voice shaky but determined. "But I needed to hear your voice. I needed my mom." Maggie had stayed on the phone for 3 hours, not offering advice or solutions, just being present while Carmen navigated the crisis. It was exactly what she'd always wanted to provide, but had rarely been allowed to give. Sophia's transformation had been perhaps the most surprising. The daughter, who had spent decades proving she didn't need anyone, had begun asking for advice. First about small things, then about increasingly significant decisions. "I'm thinking about turning down the partnership offer," she'd said during her October visit, the words coming out in a rush as if she needed to speak them before she lost her nerve. They'd been sitting in the garden, Sophia having arrived unannounced on a Friday evening, something that would have been unthinkable just 2 months earlier. "Why?" Maggie had asked, genuinely curious rather than concerned. "Because I'm not sure I want the life that comes with it. 80-hour weeks, traveling constantly, even less time for—" She gestured around the garden, at the house, at Maggie. "For this. For having a life outside of work. What does Thomas think? Thomas thinks I should do whatever makes me happy. But I'm not sure I remember what that is anymore." They'd talked until midnight, Sophia curled up in the patio chair like the child she'd once been, finally allowing herself to be uncertain, to be vulnerable, to need her mother's perspective without seeing it as weakness. In the end, Sophia had negotiated a modified partnership that gave her more control over her schedule. "I told them I had family obligations that were non-negotiable," she'd said with a grin. "You should have seen their faces." Mickey's absence was felt differently now, not as an embarrassing complication to be managed, but as a missing piece of their rebuilding family. He called Maggie twice a week from Desert Valley, their conversations brief but honest. The others had taken turns visiting him, a coordination that Dr. Weiss had encouraged. "He's different," Carmen had reported after her visit. "Clearer, like he's finally seeing himself without all the noise." "He's scared," David had added after his trip. But it's the right kind of scared. Scared of going backward rather than scared of moving forward. Sophia had been the most surprised by her reaction to seeing Mickey in treatment. "I didn't realize how much I'd missed having a little brother," she'd admitted. "Not the addict, but Mickey. The real Mickey." The first serious test of their new dynamic came in early December when David's ex-wife decided to move their children to Portland, limiting his visitation rights. The old David would have handled the crisis alone, possibly seeking financial help from Maggie, but certainly not emotional support. Instead, he'd called on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice raw with pain and anger. "I don't know what to do, Mom. My lawyer says we can fight it, but that could take months, and meanwhile the kids get pulled further away from me." Maggie had listened, really listened, as he described his relationship with his teenagers, the awkward visits, his guilt over the divorce, his fear that he was becoming as absent from their lives as he'd been from hers. "Maybe," she'd said carefully, This is an opportunity to show them that you fight for the people you love, not just with lawyers and money, but by showing up, by being present, by making them a priority. You're right, he'd said. I need to stop trying to manage this and start actually parenting. He'd flown to Seattle that weekend, not to strategize with lawyers, but to spend time with his children, to have honest conversations about the divorce, the move, and their relationship. The custody situation was still unresolved, but his relationship with his kids had shifted in ways that surprised all of them. The second test came when Carmen's husband Mark was deployed unexpectedly 2 weeks before Christmas. In previous years, this would have meant a canceled visit, with Carmen too overwhelmed to travel with 3 children on her own. Instead, she'd called Maggie with a proposition. What if we brought Christmas to you? All of us. It would be chaos, and James might have a hard time with the change in routine, but she'd paused. I want the kids to know their grandmother's house. I want them to see where their mom grew up. Yes, Maggie had said without hesitation. Absolutely yes. Sophia had immediately volunteered to fly in early to help with preparations. David had rearranged his visitation schedule to bring his teenagers to Phoenix instead of having them come to Seattle. Even Mickey, granted a day pass from Desert Valley, would join them for Christmas dinner. It'll be the first time we've all been together for Christmas in 15 years, Carmen had said, wonder in her voice. It'll be the first time we've all wanted to be together in 15 years, Sophia had corrected. Now, standing in her kitchen after David's Sunday call, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation for a family gathering. Not the anxious hope that had characterized previous holidays, when she'd prepared elaborate celebrations that often disappointed, but genuine excitement about spending time with people she was rediscovering how to love. The house felt different too. Still hers, still filled with memories, but no longer a museum to a family that had moved on. Now it was home base for a family that was learning how to come home again. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. Quick question. Should I bring my famous/infamous green bean casserole for Christmas, or should we let that family tradition die the dignified death it deserves? Maggie laughed out loud, typing back. Bring it. Some traditions are worth preserving, even the questionable ones. Fair warning, I'm also bringing Thomas's actual edible green beans as backup. Wise woman. As she set down her phone, Maggie realized she was looking forward to Christmas morning for the first time since Robert's death. Not because she was expecting perfection, but because she was expecting presence. Her children, choosing to be together not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire to rebuild what they'd almost lost. The house sale was still on hold. In 3 weeks, they'd have to decide whether these changes were sustainable, whether the growth they'd all experienced was strong enough to build on. But for now, for this moment, Maggie allowed herself to believe in the possibility of second chances. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on December 22nd, jolting Maggie from deep sleep. Carmen's name on the caller ID made her heart skip. Nothing good ever happened at this hour. Mama? Carmen's voice was tight with controlled panic. James is in the hospital. He had a massive seizure, and they can't get it to stop. We're at Denver General, and the doctors are talking about flying him to Children's Hospital in Aurora. Maggie sat up, instantly alert. In the past, this call would have come hours later, after the crisis had either resolved or escalated beyond repair. Carmen's immediate reach for her mother marked a fundamental shift in their relationship. What do you need, Mija? Maggie asked, already getting out of bed. I don't know. Mark's deployment got extended. He can't come home. The girls are with friends, but they're scared. I'm scared. And Thomas. Mama, they're talking about surgery. Brain surgery. Maggie was already moving, pulling clothes from her closet with one hand while keeping the phone pressed to her ear. I'm flying to Denver. Today. You don't have to. Carmen, I'm your mother. This is what mothers do. The silence on the other end was broken by Carmen's quiet sob. Okay, thank you. I need you. By 5 a.m., Maggie was on the phone with airlines, booking the first available flight to Denver. By 6 a.m., she was texting her other children, not to manage the crisis for Carmen, but to keep them informed as family members who would want to know. David's response came within minutes. On my way to the airport. We'll be in Denver by noon. Sophia's was equally immediate. Catching the red-eye, landing at 8 a.m. Already called the hospital. They have excellent neurosurgeons. Even Mickey, calling from Desert Valley with his counselor's permission, managed to reach Carmen directly. I'm praying for James, he told her, and I'm proud of you for asking for help. The ICU waiting room at Children's Hospital became an unexpected testing ground for everything the Torres family had been rebuilding. David arrived first, having managed to get an earlier connection through Chicago. Sophia came straight from the airport, still in her travel clothes, but carrying a detailed list of questions for the medical team. But it was Maggie's presence that seemed to anchor them all. She sat with Carmen through the endless pre-surgical consultations, holding her daughter's hand while neurosurgeons explained the risks and benefits of removing the section of James's brain that was causing the seizures. The temporal lobe resection has an 80% success rate for seizure control, Dr. Martinez explained. But there are risks. Memory issues, language problems, potential personality changes. Carmen looked at her mother with eyes that held the same terror Maggie remembered from the first time Carmen had fallen off her bicycle at age 5. What do you think, Mama? It was the question Maggie had waited 15 years to hear, not a perfunctory request for validation, but a genuine plea for maternal wisdom. I think, Maggie said carefully, that you and Mark need to make this decision together. But if you're asking what I would do, I would choose the chance for James to have a normal life over the certainty of continued seizures. Mark agrees, Carmen said. He's on satellite phone from his base. He wants to proceed. The surgery took 6 hours. During that time, the Torres family created something they hadn't had in decades, a unified presence in crisis. David handled logistics, communicating with Mark via military channels, arranging extended stays for everyone, coordinating with Carmen's neighbors to care for the girls. Sophia used her legal skills to navigate hospital bureaucracy and insurance issues. Maggie simply held space, providing the emotional anchor that allowed everyone else to function. They took turns updating Mickey, who had been granted additional phone privileges to stay connected with the family emergency. His voice was clear and strong, unmarked by the slurring that had characterized his calls for years. Tell Carmen I'm thinking about the time James tried to teach me to play Minecraft, he said during one call. Kid has patience. He's going to be fine. The crisis deepened during the second day when James developed complications, swelling that required additional intervention, and extended his recovery time indefinitely. Carmen hadn't slept in 48 hours, hadn't eaten a real meal in just as long, and was approaching the kind of breakdown that could shatter months of progress. I can't do this, she whispered to Maggie, during a moment when David and Sophia had gone to get coffee. I can't watch my son suffer. I can't make these decisions. I can't, Sire. Yes, you can, Maggie said firmly, and you're not doing it alone. But if something happens to him, then we'll face that together, all of us. But Carmen, look around this room, look at your family. You're not the only one carrying this burden anymore. Carmen looked at her siblings. David on the phone with his ex-wife, explaining why he couldn't take the kids for Christmas as planned. Sophia working with the hospital social worker to arrange extended stay accommodations, both of them choosing to be present rather than managing the crisis from a distance. When did they become? Carmen's voice trailed off. When you let them, Maggie said. When you stopped trying to handle everything alone. The breakthrough came on Christmas Eve morning, when Thomas Chen arrived unexpectedly from New York. Sophia's husband had canceled his own family obligations to be present for hers, a gesture that moved Sophia to tears. I called him, Sophia admitted to Maggie. For the first time in our marriage, I asked him to put my family first. And he didn't hesitate. Thomas's arrival coincided with positive news from the medical team. James was responding well to the latest interventions. The swelling was reducing, and his neurological functions appeared intact. Can I see him? Carmen asked Dr. Martinez. He's sedated, but yes. Family members only, though. Carmen looked around the waiting room at David, Sophia, Thomas, and Maggie. This is my family, she said simply, seeing James hooked to machines. His 15-year-old frame, looking impossibly small in the hospital bed, tested every one of their newfound strengths. But instead of fragmenting under the pressure, the family drew closer together. David, who had spent decades avoiding emotional vulnerability, sat by James's bedside reading Harry Potter aloud, something he'd done for his own children when they were younger, but had never thought to offer his nephew. Sophia used her legal precision to create detailed care plans and backup scenarios, but for the first time her intensity felt protective rather than controlling. Maggie simply provided what she'd always been best at, steady, unconditional presence that allowed everyone else to be their best selves. The ultimate test came on Christmas Day, when James woke up confused and frightened, not recognizing his surroundings or initially remembering the surgery. Carmen's immediate instinct was to panic, to blame herself, to retreat into the isolation that had characterized her crisis management for years. Instead, she looked at her mother and said, "I need help, all of you. I can't help him remember everything alone." What followed was an impromptu family history session, with each relative sharing stories about James, reminding him of his place in their world. David told him about the time James had beaten him at chess when he was only 8. Sophia reminded him of his fascination with legal procedures and his announced intention to become a lawyer for kids. Maggie shared memories of teaching him to tend her roses during summer visits. Slowly, James's confusion gave way to recognition, then relief, then the shy smile that had always been his trademark. "Abuela?" he said, focusing on Maggie. "You came to see me?" "Me, Joe," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Wild horses couldn't have kept me away." That evening, as James slept peacefully and his prognosis continued to improve, the family gathered in the hospital cafeteria for their unconventional Christmas dinner. It was nothing like the elaborate celebrations Maggie had spent decades orchestrating, but it felt more like Christmas than any gathering in recent memory. "Jake Morrison called yesterday," Maggie said quietly, looking around the table at her children. "He has a cash offer on the house. Full asking price, quick close." The silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable pauses that had once characterized their family conversations. The silence was contemplative, each person considering not just their own desires but their collective future. "What do you want to do, Mom?" David asked. For the first time in months, Maggie had a clear answer. "I want to go home, to our home, with all of you." Carmen reached across the table to squeeze her mother's hand. "Even after all this chaos? Even knowing that crises will keep happening? That we'll all revert to old patterns sometimes?"
especially because of that," Maggie said. "Because this week proved that we're actually a family again. Not perfect, but real. And real families show up for each other." Sophia nodded slowly. "I'll call Jake Morrison tomorrow. Tell him the house is off the market." "Permanently," David added, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised even him. Outside the hospital windows, snow was beginning to fall, a rare Christmas miracle in Denver. Inside, the Torres family was discovering their own miracle, the possibility of coming home to each other, no matter how far they'd traveled away. 1 year later, on October 15th, Maggie Torres woke to the sound of voices in her kitchen. For a moment, suspended between sleep and consciousness, she felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that had characterized so many birthdays, the hope that someone would remember, the fear that they wouldn't. Then she heard Mickey's laugh, rich and genuine, followed by Sophia's mock-exasperated voice saying, "No, you cannot put chocolate chips in the pancakes. That's not how pancakes work." Carmen's gentle correction, "Actually, that's exactly how pancakes work." And David's diplomatic suggestion, "Why don't we make some of each?" Maggie smiled into her pillow. This year, she knew without a doubt that her birthday was remembered. She dressed slowly, savoring the anticipation. Through her bedroom window, she could see David's rental car in the driveway, alongside Sophia's sleek sedan and Carmen's ever-practical minivan. Mickey's new truck, bought with money he'd earned from his job at a local construction company, was parked on the street, leaving room for the family vehicles in the driveway. The past year had brought changes none of them could have anticipated. Mickey had completed his program at Desert Valley and had been sober for 8 months now. The difference in him was startling. Not just the physical changes, though his clear eyes and steady hands spoke volumes, but the return of the person he'd been before addiction dimmed his light. He'd moved into a small apartment 15 minutes away and had dinner with Maggie every Tuesday, a tradition that had become sacred to both of them. Carmen had taken that art class, then another, and was now teaching watercolor lessons to seniors at the community center. Her marriage had strengthened as she'd learned to set boundaries and ask for help. James's recovery had been remarkable, seizure-free for 9 months, his cognitive functions intact, his sense of humor sharper than ever. David had surprised everyone by taking early retirement and moving to Phoenix 6 months ago. "I missed too much of my kids' childhood," he'd explained. "I don't want to miss whatever grandchildren might come along." His relationship with his teenagers had transformed as well. They visited regularly, drawn by the stability of their father's presence and the warmth of their grandmother's house. Sophia had kept her modified partnership, but had also bought a small condo in Scottsdale for long weekends, she'd claimed, though those weekends had stretched longer and more frequent. Thomas had proven surprisingly adaptable to desert life, declaring Phoenix's restaurant scene far superior to anything he'd expected. As Maggie entered the kitchen, she was greeted by a scene that would have been unimaginable 2 years ago. Her 4 children moved around each other with easy familiarity, David flipping pancakes while Sophia set the table with Maggie's good china, the set that had sat unused in the hutch for years. Carmen arranged flowers from the garden in a vase, and Mickey poured coffee into mugs that had been wedding gifts 45 years ago. "Happy birthday, Abuela," James called from his spot at the breakfast bar, where he was reading a book, a new passion since his recovery. At 16, he'd grown tall and lean, his seizure scars hidden by hair that perpetually fell across his forehead. "Buenos dias, mijo," Maggie replied, kissing the top of his head. 81 years old, Sophia announced, presenting her mother with a perfectly wrapped gift. "How does it feel?" "Like I'm just getting started," Maggie said, and meant it. The morning unfolded with the easy rhythm they developed over the past year. Breakfast featured both regular pancakes and Mickey's chocolate chip version, which, Carmen had to admit, were surprisingly good. Presents were opened with the kind of thoughtful attention that spoke to how well they'd all learned to see each other. David had framed and matted several of Carmen's watercolors, creating a gallery of her artistic journey. Carmen had commissioned a custom photo album that chronicled the family's past year of healing, including pictures from James's hospital stay, Mickey's graduation from Desert Valley, and Sophia's birthday surprise visit in April. Sophia's gift was practical but precious, a state-of-the-art security system for the house, installed by a company that specialized in aging-in-place modifications. "So you can stay here as long as you want," she'd said simply. Mickey's gift was the most surprising, a small wooden box he'd made in the workshop at his apartment complex. Inside, nestled in velvet, was Maggie's grandmother's ring, the one he'd sold years ago to pay for rehab. "I've been tracking it down for 6 months," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Found it at a pawn shop in Tempe. It cost me 3 months' worth of overtime, but—" He shrugged, unable to finish the sentence. Maggie slipped the ring onto her finger for the first time in years, feeling the weight of forgiveness and redemption. "Mijo," she whispered, pulling him into a hug that felt like coming home. The afternoon brought visitors: Rosa Martinez with her daughter, now 8 and fascinated by James's stories about brain surgery, Ellie Kowalski with a casserole and her characteristic bluntness. "You all finally figured out how to be a family, huh?" Dr. Patricia Weiss, who had become more friend than therapist over the past months. Jake Morrison stopped by with a bottle of wine and an update on the neighborhood real estate market. "Your house would be worth even more now," he told Maggie with a grin. "But I'm glad you decided to keep it." "So am I," Maggie replied, looking around at her full house, her thriving garden, her family scattered across the patio in various stages of conversation and laughter. The evening brought the kind of celebration Maggie had dreamed of, but never quite achieved in all her years of elaborate party planning. There was no formal structure, no assigned seating, no stress about whether the food was perfect or the decorations adequate. Instead, there was presence, pure and simple. Mickey grilled hamburgers while telling James about his construction projects. David and Thomas discussed investment strategies while helping with the cooking. Sophia and Carmen collaborated on a salad, their conversation ranging from legal ethics to parenting challenges to their mother's newfound interest in hiking. Maggie moved between groups, no longer the anxious hostess trying to manage everyone's happiness, but simply a woman enjoying her family's company. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of coral and gold, the family gathered around the patio table for dinner. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the comfortable silences that spoke to deep contentment. "I want to make a toast," David said, raising his wine glass. "To Mom, who taught us that it's never too late to come home." "To Maggie," Sophia added, "who showed us that asking for what you need isn't selfish, it's brave." "To Mama," Carmen continued, "who proved that love sometimes means forcing people to grow up." "To Mom," Mickey finished, his voice steady and clear, "who never gave up on us, even when we gave up on ourselves." "To family," Maggie said, looking around the table at faces that had become dear to her all over again. "To second chances and new beginnings." As they clinked glasses under the desert stars, Maggie felt a deep satisfaction settle in her chest. This wasn't the family they'd once been. That family was gone, lost to time and choices and the inevitable complications of adult life. This was better. This was a family built on honesty rather than obligation, presence rather than perfection, choice rather than duty. The house around them held new memories now, layered over the old ones like sediment in the desert floor. Mickey's 90-day chip sat on the kitchen windowsill next to the ceramic owl Carmen's youngest daughter had made in art class. David's business cards were tucked into the phone book, local numbers replacing the Seattle ones. Sophia's coffee maker, an industrial-strength model that could handle her morning needs, had found a permanent place on the counter. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the guests had gone home, after her children had reluctantly returned to their own homes with promises to call soon, Maggie sat in her garden among the roses that had witnessed so much history. The Rosa de Guadalupe bloomed pink and fragrant in the cool October air, as faithful as ever. Ellie appeared at the garden gate, as she had so many times over the decades of their friendship. "Good birthday?" she asked, settling into the patio chair that had become hers by default. "The best?" Maggie said, and meant it completely. "Any regrets about not selling?" Maggie looked at her house, the place where she'd raised her children, buried her husband, lost herself, and found her way back to what mattered most. The windows glowed with warm light, ready to welcome anyone who wanted to come home. "None," she said. "This is exactly where I belong." In the distance, a coyote called across the desert, its voice carrying across the vastness of the Arizona night. Maggie smiled, thinking of all the ways people could lose each other and, if they were very lucky and very brave, find their way back home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. ...